The slogan, Fight for Children's Rights, CPS Stop Stealing Our Kids for Money, came from the fightcps.com site. It's a site where people who have had problems with Child Protective Services or who have had their children taken by CPS can go to get help and advice from other people.
Okay.
All of these families had their children taken on frivolous charges and often false evidence, and there was no due process for them in family court. The reason why it says stop stealing our kids for money is because that's a major motivating factor for CPS, because they get federal funds for each child that they place in foster care or that they place for adoption. And this was the result of two very bad pieces of legislation. One was the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, called CAPTA, which was promoted by Walter Mondale, and the other was the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which was passed later under the Clinton administration. But both of these pieces of legislation required that federal funds be given to Child Protective Services to take children away from families. It was done allegedly to give them an incentive to be very zealous in protecting children from abuse, but unfortunately it's made them overzealous in taking children away from families where there is no abuse.
Oh.
There seems to be a bipartisan effort amongst the majority of Democrats and Republicans in the Congress to keep bolstering this legislation and to cover up the corruption that it causes. There are certainly a lot of irregularities and lack of due process in all of the court proceedings regarding Child Protective Services and removal of children and termination of parental rights. The fact that there are no jury trials involved, and the fact that they don't have the same standards of evidence that are required in most criminal trials. A person charged with murder has more rights than a parent charged with child abuse, no matter how unsubstantiated the charges are. Nancy Schaefer, the state senator from Georgia, was very active in trying to expose the corruption in Child Protective Services nationwide. And unfortunately, she and her husband were found dead about a week ago. The circumstances of their death, it was reported as a suicide pact. They were trying to say that her husband, who was terminally ill with cancer, killed his wife and himself. But the circumstances of their death doesn't look like that. Nancy had a gunshot wound in the back, and her husband had one in his chest. These people were, as I say, they were both active, especially Nancy, in exposing corruption. And Nancy Schaefer was actually going to plan to run for president on this issue. She was also planning to write a book about Child Protective Services, and her death, the timing of her death was very suspicious. There's no evidence that she or her husband were depressed and suicidal. And her husband, who was very supportive of her efforts, would have had no motive to kill her or even himself. His cancer was under control. We all would like to see a thorough investigation into the death of Nancy Schaefer, including investigation as to possible foul play, because we think the public deserves to know the truth. We think that there should have been an independent investigation by the coroner and forensic experts, because You know, we're not saying for sure that she was murdered. We don't know all the evidence, but we definitely want it to be brought to light, because certainly if there is any foul play, we want it to be exposed. Kit and I have very clean criminal records. In fact, we don't have any criminal records. And Kit is a true gentleman. He would never hit anyone. And yet we were both demonized by CPS, especially my husband Kit was demonized as being a potential abuser, accused of being possibly violent, even though he's never been convicted of any violent crime in his life. And Kit has never been arrested for any alcohol-related offenses, and yet in spite of that, Child Protective Services was trying to label him as an alcoholic. Dana Zemke and Leslie Moran, two social workers with CPS, falsely accused my husband Kit of being an opium addict. This was not the case. Back in 2004, he had a back operation and was legally prescribed some painkillers for his back. Leslie Moran and Dana Zemke somehow thought it was inappropriate for him to have those pills, even though they were legally prescribed. The temporary crib that my mother was mentioning earlier was actually a plastic box purchased from Staples that we put cushioning in for Sabrina. It was not dangerous in any way. We actually showed it to Judge Allman in court one day. He could clearly see what it looked like and that there were no sharp edges on it. And yet in his decision against us, he put in writing in that decision that we kept Sabrina in a milk crate. He saw the box. He could clearly see it was not a milk crate, and so he put a blatant lie in his decision. What Allman said was tantamount to perjury.